Hi, welcome to Module 1.1, Defining and Scoping the Project. As always, we'd like to thank CMHC for their support of this course through the project Community-Led Design for Specialized Housing in the North, and to acknowledge the partnership that makes this course possible between Nishnawbe Aski Nation, Together Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, and the WASA Distance Education Centre. In this module, we hope to answer the following questions. What is a project scope, and why is it important to have a clear definition? What are different strategies for creating a well-defined project scope? And what are the risks of a poorly defined project scope, and how can these be avoided? I'm also hoping I can show you through this presentation that creating a project scoping statement, the focus of what we're going to be learning about in this module, isn't a single act, but instead a process that you're going to start and stop and restart until you can really define the vision of the project. When we're talking about a project scoping statement, we're right at the beginning of a project, and the project manager's job is to clearly define what the project will be and build out that vision in a way that everyone can understand it. One of the first places to start in this journey is to define the problem that you're solving. In any community, no housing project can solve all of the housing needs in that community. And so it's important to describe and understand what particular problem this project is trying to address. And once you've identified that problem, you're able to begin to define the specific characteristics of what a solution would look like. And through the scoping process, you can begin to define those characteristics and make clear what your goals are. It's also your job as the project manager through this process to do research, whether that be through past case studies or looking at market conditions, to make sure that the vision that you're putting forward is realistic and feasible. And we'll talk about some of the ways of doing that in the modules that are coming up about preparing an initial budget and assessing project risks. But what's important throughout that process is to remember that why you're conducting that research is to help better define your scoping statement. And so always come back to that statement and try to build your learnings in. The scoping statement itself is something that you should be using to succinctly define your project. It's the elevator pitch. It's your way of describing to anybody exactly what you're doing in this project. And the clearer that you are at this stage in recording what the goals are, what it is you're trying to produce, who it is that's going to produce it, what it will cost, how long it will take, and any of the other questions that you see on screen here. The less ambiguity, the clearer you are at this stage, the easier it will be as we move through the stages of the construction process. One of the main things you want to avoid is a lack of clarity or ambiguity that allows others to make assumptions about what your project is. Because those assumptions may not pan out in the project, or it may create kind of a false understanding for people that can really lead to project delays and uncertainty down the road. And that can really, as I said, create delays and expand the time frame of the project, as well as creating cost overruns. As I pointed out on the previous slide, the main reason to do this is to create clarity for all parties interested in the outcome of a project. A clear scoping statement really ensures that everyone involved in the project is pushing in the same direction. And it's also why it's important for the process of creating a statement to be iterative, to acknowledge that while you, as the project manager, are the one creating the statement, it's only going to be possible to get close to consensus if it's formed through engaging various interested parties. First among those you would engage are the project's decision makers, and in the context that we're talking about, that often means chief and council. But they aren't the only ones who should be engaged, and instead you should think about community members, potentially your tribal council, and others who will be involved throughout the project. and getting as much information as you can to make the clearest possible statement. And while we'll talk about engagement specifically in section 2, this is one of those first important places where you need to recognize all of the different people who are going to be involved in a project and try to build in their perspectives. One of the challenges with a scoping statement and scoping your project in general is the risk of scope creep. Scope creep is the process where a project's focus continues to grow or shift after it's been started. This can mean adding or changing deliverables, changing roles and responsibilities, or any other change that really impacts the scoping statement. And the problem with scope creep is that it almost always impacts either the budget or time. And as a project manager, those are two things that you really never want to change. So why does scope creep happen? There's two main reasons. The first is that the project scope wasn't clearly defined to start with. And often what that means here is that there weren't firm enough boundaries on the project, and people had room to interpret things differently and add their own perspectives to the project. Or people weren't engaged in defining the scope to begin with. And so you weren't working with all of the information or a full picture from the beginning. And now you're having to add new information to the project once it's already started. So how do you prevent scope creep? You put in the time and effort right at the beginning to make sure that you're working with as much information as possible and that your scoping statement that's created acknowledges all of the different and necessary viewpoints. Now, we all know that with construction projects, things rarely go as planned totally. And so there has to be some flexibility built into the process. But that doesn't mean that your scoping statement should be so pliable that everyone can put in changes. Instead, what you want to do is establish an agreed upon process with whoever the ultimate decision makers are in your project, as I said, likely chief and council, on how to deal with unexpected changes so that there is an agreed upon way of making changes to the scope if required without everybody being able to change the scope whenever. Now, along with this module, we've provided you with a scoping statement template. Now, this looks like, and it is, a pretty basic template sheet, but I hope what we've been able to convey so far is the idea that you don't just sit down at your desk and write a single scoping statement, and instead that this is an iterative and generative process. So what that means is that you're going to end up writing and working with interested parties around the project to write many scoping statements. And so I would encourage you to use this template more as a brainstorming tool and to think when you're going into meetings or after you've done some budget research, how have any of the categories on this template changed? Or how do they differ from person to person or organization to organization? And then when you're reflecting or creating your overall scoping statement, assembling all of your templates around you and trying to use all of the information that you collected to build a kind of comprehensive scoping statement. And so don't try to fill this out just once, but fill it out many times to give yourself as much information as possible and to bring everyone's input on board. For the rest of this discussion, what we're going to look through is a few examples, and I have the kind of most basic dichotomy or two examples on screen here, and obviously you'll see that one's better developed than the other. But as we go through the rest of the examples, and these are taken from kind of real life practice of the project team here, what I want you to do is not look for which one you think is the best or which one you should be copying, because I wouldn't say that any of these statements are perfect, but instead look for elements that you think you could build into your next scoping statement. Look for things that you'd love to build on in your practice or things that maybe you want to avoid. So first we can start with this kind of obvious example and the difference between building 4 houses and meeting all of the requirements and terms in the agreements with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, we will construct 4 3-bedroom houses by October 2026 for a total of $2.1 million. Houses will be constructed using traditional stick frame construction, using a mix of local and external labor, and will offer training to 3 community members. Houses will comply with Ontario Building Code. So obviously in these 2 examples, you can see how one addresses many more of the criteria that we were looking to build into a scoping statement, and the other, let's build 4 houses, is way too general and leaves room for all of that ambiguity and uncertainty that we're looking to try to avoid. But when you're actually building a scoping statement, it all gets a little bit more complicated than this. So let's look at and go through 4 more examples to try to get a better sense of what you'll actually be doing as the project manager. In this first example, using the $6,732,000 allocated by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation through a special grant to build the maximum number of homes possible in the year 2026 on existing lots that are currently vacant. In this example, you see a pretty clear sense of goals, but the deliverables aren't as certain. We understand that this money is allocated by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, but without listing clearly the kind of number of units, the type of units, who's going to be responsible for that building, there's still a lot of ambiguity. We do have a fairly clear budget and time frame, so those are positives, but we aren't clear on the risks or quality standards. So while we can see that this building project is going to align to a funding program and it's going to happen in 1 year, there's still a lot of room to be clearer about what's being built and how it's being built. And we leave these questions here on the side of each example. And I hope that you can use those when you're reviewing this or when you come back to these in the future to think about, is there non-essential information that's being included here that should be removed? And often when we have non-essential information in a scoping statement, it just leads to confusion, and the longer these get, the less likely people are to actually read through them and properly take on board all the information. Is there anything essential that's missing? And I've gone through from my perspective what some of the necessary components that aren't here are, but you might identify others. And that leads us to this last point, is how might this project scope change if it was being done somewhere different? And that's the lens that I hope you bring to each of these examples, is knowing your community and knowing the building context that you're in. What's the extra information that would be needed to make this work? Or what would need to be changed in this to make it relevant for your situation? So let's go to the next example. Example 2. In order to generate economic development for the First Nation, 3 houses will be built in 2026 using entirely local labor. In addition, materials should be sourced from businesses in which the community owns an existing share. External labor should only be used after all local options have been exhausted, and then tendering should look to maximize local training opportunities to reduce future need for external labor. Now, you can see a quite different goal in this one. While the previous scoping statement's goal was really closely tying a construction project to a funding package, here we see the goal of a construction project really being local economic development. And those are both totally acceptable. These just represent different visions for a housing project. Here we can really see the focus on skills training, on local labor, on local economic development generation. But what that comes at the cost of in this statement, or what we don't see in this statement, is a discussion really of cost, of time, of specific deliverables. But what you can see is how different values and different local priorities can get embedded into construction projects. And that's why it's really important to go through this exercise. What you see on screen here might be totally relevant to your community and might represent the way that you want to move forward with a housing project. Or you might be more closely aligned with the first one in the next project you're taking on. Both of these are visions for construction projects that are totally different. So let's look at a third one. To build a home for Mrs. North and her 4 children. The house will be detached, 1,300 square foot unit located on lot 358 at 46 First Street. The project will break ground on May 3rd, 2025, or earlier if ground conditions allow, with substantial completion no later than December 6th, 2025. Design should maximize passive heating opportunities. The building should meet or exceed Ontario Building Code and look for opportunities to reduce mold development. Tendering and procurement of materials and contractors will be managed locally and look to use at minimum 35% local labor. So, in this example, you see many of the criteria we're looking for: goals, deliverables, division of responsibilities, cost, time, quality standards, and risks, addressed in a much more focused way than what we've seen in either of the previous 2 examples. One of the reasons that that might be possible, or so simple to articulate for this project, is that this project is only looking to build one house. And so what you might find in your practice is that the smaller the project, the easier it is to create a bounded scoping statement. The goal in this project is quite simple: to build a house for one already identified family. And that might make it really easy to move through a design phase, a site selection phase, and many of the challenges associated with larger building projects might not be present here. And so while this may look like a really good scoping statement, it might not always be possible to get to this level of detail at this stage of a larger construction project. But you may still be able to take some of the principles and some of the things that you find particularly effective about this one, if you do find things particularly effective, and build them into construction projects even when they are larger. But you may also recognize that when you're working in these smaller bounded projects, the need to be very specific, so that while undertaking this project, you don't encounter the kind of scope creep that we talked about earlier, and end up also trying to build, let's say, a shed for the house next to Mrs. North's house. So let's look at one last example. To address the needs of single adults and reduce overcrowding and family doubling, purchase 6 modular tiny homes. Tiny homes will be installed on lots 6B, 9, 12C, 28, 47, and 90. Occupants should be selected from the existing housing waitlist and prioritize members currently living in overcrowded situations. Now, what you see in this example is a little bit of a shift in goals to also including the occupancy stage and how occupants will be selected. What this scoping statement might be addressing is a risk that was identified at the community level that once this housing project is complete, there would be challenges that the project manager or others in the community might face in selecting occupants. And so they have, right from this project initiation phase, identified how occupants would be selected. Now, this might also relate to the point we made earlier about identifying what problem we're trying to solve and being very clear about it. So while this is quite different from the other scoping statements we've reviewed, it might actually be a good example of putting some of the context-specific lessons into practice. Now, these might not be relevant to your project at all, but what they should show you is how you can embed the problem you're trying to solve and specific characteristics about how you'd like it to be solved directly into your scoping statement. And again, as this is our last example, I want to say that I don't think any of these is a perfect scoping statement. They're just examples of different elements that are more successful or less successful. And that's really just from my read. I encourage you to read each of these critically and think about what works and what doesn't work. And instead of looking to kind of copy any one of these particular statements, think about how you can use elements or components of each of these statements in your next project. I hope that through this module, you've gained a better understanding of what a scoping statement is and why it's important, how to avoid scope creep and why you want to avoid it, and then through those examples, gain some ideas about how you might approach building your next scoping statement. And we hope also that the template that's been provided can be used as an effective brainstorming tool for you in initiating your next project. As always, the references and resources on screen show you where you might be able to head if you want to learn more about any of the things we've discussed in this module. Thank you.